Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. Lorena Inclan is joining us today.
Hi, everybody.
We got
Finally made it.
Yeah. If you've been waiting on us, Lorena had an exciting morning.
I did. I usually am off today, but
Right.
a coworker and I switched. She needed the day off, so I did her the favor. And it never a dull moment in the life of a news reporter, because there was a breaking news at a bank robbery on Lane Avenue. I just came from there.
We talked about this a couple weeks ago when we did like the media kind of glimpse into your world and your life, and today was the perfect example of like you're supposed to be off, but you know sometimes you switch with people and you know help them out, they help you out, and and you had already called and said, hey, look, everything's fine, but I'm gonna have to rush out. Like once we're done, I'm gonna have to leave. I can't really hang out. And we were like, yeah, sure, no problem. And then this morning you called and you're like, so there was a bank robbery. I'm over here reporting.
Turns out I'm rushing in instead of rushing out.
So
and it was not just any regular, bank robbery. I mean, we cover those a lot, and a lot of times the suspects get away and things like that. Nobody gets hurt. But in this case, just real quick, because
tell us about it.
a woman walked into a bank, SunTrust on Lane Avenue, and she handed a note to a teller, or not a teller, a personal banker, saying that she was being forced to rob the bank. Outside, there were 3 suspects that an FBI agent was able to arrest because he heard the call go out and he happened to be in the area. I mean, just one of the most bizarre cases I've ever covered.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you had to stick around. They did a little press conference or something?
Yep.
And
they did. They did a briefing at 11:30, and then I was live at noon, which is why I'm late. So thank you, everybody, for waiting for us, and I'm sorry for the tardiness.
No problem. This is your world,
Yeah,
and
it
that's
is.
the world of breaking news.
Yeah.
And
thank you for waiting for me.
Absolutely. No, we try to do these at noon, but people schedule. We never know if they're going to watch them now or later anyway.
True, that's true. That's the good thing. You can watch them later.
Yeah, they can watch it later. So we're fine. We just want to get the information out there, and we try to work that around all of our schedules, and we don't always take into account bank robberies.
I know, right? Exactly. I mean, breaking news can happen at any time. It's crazy.
Thank you for immediately coming here, and we saw the news van drop you off in the middle of the road.
I'm a woman of my word. I said I was going to be here, and I am here.
Right.
So
well, thank you. We're going to talk today about the John Paul Stoner case, which was there was actually a double homicide. Leonard Davis was his roommate, and they were both murdered in March 2008 here in Jacksonville, over at an apartment complex off of Harts Road area.
He lived there with his family too.
He lived there with his family too, a wife, a number of children.
Yeah, I believe.
Two daughters or a son.
A son and a daughter that I know of. Yeah.
So, and then we're gonna watch your segment that you did for Action News Jax, which was last year. I mean, these things we keep. Time
and it's
flies,
still
and
unsolved.
it's still unsolved. And let's watch your segment, and then we'll talk a little bit, because I went back and re-listened to the podcast this morning and stuff, and there was definitely interesting stuff in there. So watch this segment, and then we'll come back and talk about it.
41-year-old John Stoner was married. He was a dad and even a grandpa. He moved to Jacksonville from Pennsylvania to start fresh in a new city. How long was he living in Jacksonville before he died?
Almost 2 years.
His sister, Siobhan Gerard, can't forget that day, March 5th, 2008.
I was at work and I got the phone call that he had been killed. And I flew right down. I didn't believe he was dead. I kept on calling his phone. And
Stoner had been beaten with a bat and shot to death, along with his friend and roommate, 69-year-old Leonard Davis. They lived in this corner unit on Harts Road with Stoner's wife and their 2 kids. 10 years later, and the apartment complex has changed its name, but the unit where it happened remains the same. JSO tells me that it was Stoner's own teenage daughter who discovered the bodies. They were in a back room, badly beaten and shot.
I cleaned up the room. I did. It was a mess. His handprints were all over the walls. There was pieces of him all over the place.
Detective Ray Reeves has now taken over the case.
In this, there are photographs, there are discs from interviews at the time, transcripts from some potential persons of interest.
At least 2 persons of interest, likely underage at the time, were named.
It was not uncommon for the young people to hang out over at their apartment.
One of the working theories is that the men were killed over drugs.
This was an apartment that Mr. Stoner and Mr. Davis were selling marijuana out of the apartment, and so that opened up another huge avenue of people, of clients, as it were, to speak with.
Reeves says the apartment had been ransacked. Money and a gun were also missing.
We're looking for, in particular, 2 people to talk to and some physical evidence or some of that proof that we would need to hopefully bring a charge.
Despite the passage of time, Gerard says she's still grieving.
We need some kind of closure. We need answers.
The murderer took more than her brother. She tells me they also took her peace of mind.
I don't want this to happen to anybody else. And these kids need to get off the streets before they do it again.
Lorena Inclan, CBS 47, Action News Jax.
If you know anything that can help police solve this or other unsolved murders, call Crime Stoppers at 866-845-TIPS. You can stay anonymous.
All right, there you go. That one was a pretty emotional and descriptive piece that you guys put together. I mean,
I thought about whether or not to include some of the very graphic details, and the thing is, I think it's important for people to know what happens. You know what I mean? Like, this is, I'm not trying to sugarcoat anything.
No.
This is the reality of violent crime.
and this is the reality of what the families are
Right.
faced with after.
Right.
So you saw Siobhan there. You know, she drove up here. She doesn't live in Jacksonville. She drove up
Long drive.
to do this interview. I think they had people fly in from Pennsylvania to be a part of this and be supportive.
Correct.
And she's sitting there describing what it's like to go into the scene. First of all, John Stoner's daughter finds her dad murdered, and then his sister has to go in and clean up the crime scene. And people probably don't realize this, that once the police release the scene and they've collected all the evidence that they need, it's not their responsibility to clean it up.
I actually didn't know that, and that's. Can you imagine as a family member cleaning up the blood of your loved one?
No, it's horrible, and there are companies out there that's their job is crime scene cleanup or biohazardous cleanup and stuff like that, because you're dealing with bodily fluids. But we have encountered a few situations where family members actually, like, they did it by choice, because it's expensive, to hire somebody to come in and clean up. Sometimes there's assistance for that through victim compensation in some situations.
They
but
get reimbursed?
They can get reimbursed for it, but it takes a lot, I mean, it's a upfront expense, and it's expensive. And a lot of times the cleanup is literally cleanup. So they'll cut out carpet, cut out drywall, and then leave that, and then you got to come back in and repair that and replace that.
Right.
So,
and the emotional toll.
So the emotional, if you can imagine the trauma of losing somebody you love to violence, where, especially in this situation where he's beaten and shot. Right. 2 victims are beaten and shot.
And I believe the daughter was 16 at the time.
Yeah, she was in school. I think listening to the podcast this morning, she had gone off to school. Right. And I guess when she came home, this was the scene that she found.
Horrific.
And then the sister has to clean it up, and you could just see and hear from her how traumatic that was.
And those are the sister's kids who she's hugging in that video.
Yeah. They flew in to support her, I think, from Pennsylvania. Yeah. And so I mean, this was this was one of those cases that. It appeared that there may have been drugs involved, and that was mentioned in the story and in the podcast. And so that brought up a point that both of us wanted to address today. One was we hear from families sometimes that are concerned that because their loved one may have been buying or selling or using drugs, or sometimes it's prostitution or something. There's a lot of times a fear that law enforcement is not going to give those cases the priority that they would.
Or media.
Or media,
think.
right? Media too, as well. You had actually archive footage in that piece where your station had obviously covered it when it
Back
happened.
in 2008.
And we get that question a lot, about the cases you see behind us. Yeah, there are people there that were buying drugs. Yes, there are people that were selling drugs. Yes, there are people that use drugs. None of those factors equal or allow for someone to be murdered and a life to be taken.
Exactly.
And I always want people to remember too that we're serving their families, and a lot of times, of course, the families, that's not what they wanted their loved one to be doing at the time, but that doesn't define their loved one. They don't lose value as a human being because they were a part of something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you can't see through that part of it, you know what I mean, then we also want you to recognize and realize that we can't just have vigilantes out there shooting and killing people because, at their whim. These are bad people that were willing to shoot and steal and rob.
And beat two people. Regardless of whether or not they were selling marijuana out of their apartment, because JSO, that's what they told us, that's what was happening.
Right.
And it does appear that it was some sort of robbery as well, because there was a gun missing, there was money missing. So I believe that it stems from that. But here's the thing. That doesn't only impact that family. That impacts that neighborhood. Right. That impacts, the entire community, whether or not it was a drug deal or whatever the case may be. It's not about, the victim might have put themselves in that position. No, that's not what this is about. What this is about is that there was a murder, a horrific 2 murders that happened that day. And these people or person who did this, they're still out there potentially committing more crimes.
Right.
So that is the most important part of this. A lot of people, like you mentioned, will say, the media doesn't care about my family because they were involved in this and that, whatever. Here's a case of where we covered a story where it appears that, something illegal was going on out of that apartment. But this is still a story because it's a double murder happening inside a home where a family lives, in a neighborhood where other families live. Those bullets that hit the two people in this case, the 2 victims in this case, could have easily hit the kid who lives next door.
Right.
The mom,
a wall.
Exactly.
Through a window.
So it should be important to everyone, regardless of the circumstance.
It's not our place to sit here and judge
not at all.
these victims for decisions they made in their life, nor do we know the background and the full story, and
regardless, nobody deserves to be beaten and shot,
Nobody deserves that. And what the family does deserve is answers and justice. We just can't have people walking the streets that kill other individuals for any reason.
That's the most important part of this. It just shouldn't happen. And they shouldn't have been allowed to be free for more than a decade.
Now we're, I think we're at how long? 2008. So now we're at 11 years. I think when we did this, it had just been 10 years. We're now 11 years after this murder.
And by the way, I don't know if you guys caught in the story that the suspects at the time were believed to be teenagers. Think about that, teenagers already with that kind of violence.
And going back and listening to the podcast, 2 things. Detective Ray Reeves, he emphasizes that the drug aspect of this didn't affect how they investigated the case, but it opened up the avenues for where to look in the investigation.
It gave them clues.
Right. And so,
and it goes to show they are looking into it. I mean, even though this was a situation of a drug deal potentially, or
but it
whatever
starts
the case
to
may be.
put persons of interest in, because now it narrows your focus. And so, sometimes families may be hesitant to tell the full truth. I don't know if that was the case in this situation, but but you want law enforcement to have all the information.
Absolutely.
So that they can do the best investigation possible. Going back and researching this case again, there was a witness. It was like a cable guy that was next door upstairs and installing cable or something, and he sees a juvenile fleeing the apartment. And so there are persons of interest in this case. At the time, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office was trying to locate them and potentially re-interview them or see if if they had gotten into any more trouble since
Right.
then. They stopped a little short of calling them suspects. I think there's still some questions about what all happened in that day
Right.
in that apartment.
And it takes so much for them to really get to that point where they can call them a suspect. I mean,
Right,
they need evidence. They need maybe an eyewitness. They need cooperating witnesses, right?
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
I think, some of that
this is
was
scary.
yeah.
Can you imagine knowing something about this? And I totally understand why unfortunately, some people really don't want to say anything because it is a scary situation.
It is. And Detective Reeves talked about that in the podcast too. Like, he gets it that you have to live there and you have to interact with these people that you're potentially going to snitch on, but 11 years later, how.
And these teenagers are adults now. If they're
they're-
still living or if they haven't been arrested for something else. So who knows how many other incidents they've been involved in. So this is obviously something that affects everyone.
Yeah. And I think it's obviously important to remember that Crime Stoppers, is out there for this purpose, that if you are still worried, if you are still scared to make that call and to give that information, call Crime Stoppers and remain anonymous.
This has torn apart that family. If I remember correctly, some family members don't talk that much with others.
Exactly. The family was so devastated by this that it, Siobhan talks about how John needed some money to go back, was wanting to go back to
Yes.
Pennsylvania. He'd only lived here for 2 years.
For 2 years. He wanted a fresh start. That's why he came here.
And obviously the fresh start didn't really work out, so he was looking to go back. She felt a bit of responsibility for not being able to provide him the money he needed. That is not her responsibility, but that's the feeling as a family member when somebody's murdered. If I could have done this, would it have stopped that? And that's a torturous cycle to be in.
And it's wrong, right?
Yeah.
It's not their fault.
It is not her fault
that
by
guilt,
any means.
But it's almost inevitable to feel that way,
Well,
right?
and then absolutely, and then there was talk about maybe these juveniles that were persons of interest were known by the victim's daughters,
Right, yeah.
and so then your brain starts working, and,
Right.
and you start thinking, why do they have more information? You just see how the longer these families wait, the more it's driving this divide
Right.
between them. And we've seen this happen in other cases where kind of rumors started, and after years and decades, family members started believing the rumors. And then when an arrest actually happened, those rumors were so far from
Right.
the actual truth that by that time it had driven, wedges in the families that were potentially irreparable. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Right.
And they weren't true. It was just, again, we've talked about it before, like your brain, you start trying to find logic in a situation that sometimes there isn't logic. Why did this happen? Who could have known? Who should have known? Who could have done something? Who should have
Exactly.
done something? And when you get into those what ifs and shoulda, coulda, wouldas, you really just torture yourself.
Yeah, that's that word torture. I mean, and that they live with that for decades. And a lot of times, I'm sure victims, you're your own worst enemy, right? Because your
absolutely.
mind just starts going off in different directions.
You're desperate to find something. All of your control has been taken. You have no control over the investigation. You have
Right.
no control over the prosecution. You have no control over the evidence, what's available, what can be tested, what has been tested. You really are helpless as a family member, and so you're constantly trying to figure out ways that you can impact and help, that
Right.
you can be an asset to the investigation, and sometimes that leads you down a path that if you just that's like looking through a telescope. If you're just a little bit off, a decade later you're way off.
Right,
your
exactly,
path has
exactly.
gone veered way away.
The more time passes, the more you want answers, and you just want to be able to figure out get justice. I mean, at the end of the day.
Yeah, and this was we've talked. You have aired cases that have no suspects, no persons of interest, no physical evidence,
Nothing.
Yeah,
It's almost
And you really those are the cases where you're like, gosh, just hopefully somebody out there sees this and can come forward with something. And then there's cases like this where there were at least people identified, there were people interviewed.
There's a witness.
You know, a bat was used, you know, so you don't know if there's some physical evidence there. There was a gun that was stolen that could potentially have been the gun used also in the crime. That obviously wasn't recovered that we know of. So
and for it to be such a violent murder, beating and shooting, that wasn't done in a quiet way.
No.
You know, like there had to have been and in that community,
multiple victims too.
And multiple victims. Like there had to have been some sort of struggle, some sort of screaming. I mean, at some point, you hear the gunshots as well. And that's a neighborhood where it's kind of like townhouses. Yeah. It's not, you know, one single home. It's, you know, people share walls.
Connected walls, yeah.
Yes. So I can't imagine, you know, a stay-at-home mom maybe, you know, listening to all this commotion, being terrified, you know.
Sure.
So I would venture to say that it's very possible that there were other, maybe not eyewitnesses, but ear witnesses that heard something that could help now. So much time has passed.
11 years has passed. Somebody has said something. If there were multiple, and the investigators indicated that there were multiple juveniles present. Right. There's obviously the one that is seen running away, but there were a couple of others. So, you know, I feel like, you know,
there's, and also maybe you lived in that neighborhood and you don't live there anymore.
Right.
You know, 11 years almost now. So, maybe now is the time where you're like, I kind of did hear all that commotion. I'm just going to call. And even if all you heard was a scream or a gunshot, that's fine. Just call that in.
Right.
Just call it.
And Detective Reeves mentions that in the podcast. And again, you can go to actionnewsjax.com/Project Cold Case, and you can see this story. We just replayed it for you, but you can also listen to the podcast, which is about 45 or 50 minutes long, and it includes an interview with John's sister, Siobhan. It includes the full interview with Detective Ray Reeves. It includes a short interview with me talking about this, and he specifically, you know, mentions, Detective Reeves, that is, specifically mentions anything would be helpful in this case. Anything. This case particularly needs public, you know, input and the support of the community to be solved.
And I want people to think about that. Like, detectives can solve this case, but they can only solve it if you call them. Right. I mean, it's up to the public. And they can only do so much.
And you know, it's one of those things, like, we get emails all the time from people that are we jokingly refer to them as armchair detectives. They watch Investigation Discovery. They listen to true crime podcasts. And, you know, a lot of times those shows are set up so that you have an idea of who to look at, you know, in the end. I mean, a real investigation does not take an hour. A real investigation takes a long time and a lot of man hours, multiple people. And you got to remember, the information you're being provided on those TV shows and podcasts is what those producers want you to see and hear. You know, not necessarily everything that came in. But we get emails from people that watch those shows all the time, and they want to help solve the crimes, and like, everybody wants to help solve a murder, you know.
Yeah, and wouldn't that be great if we could all do that?
Yeah, and it would be great. And there's somebody out there with the opportunity to do that in this case.
Absolutely.
You know,
the witnesses, people with information, somebody who heard, maybe these teenagers who are now adults, maybe you heard them bragging about it. Maybe, I don't know, it slipped one day.
Right. Well, and you know, if there were multiple suspects, maybe one wasn't necessarily a part of the actual murder, and maybe they told someone, you know, I can't believe what so-and-so did, or what so-and-so and so-and-so did, you know, and I just got out of there, you know. I mean, who knows what that scenario is, but it's hard to believe that conversation hasn't happened somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, you know, there's John Paul Stoner. His sister, Siobhan, reached out to us yesterday and informed us that today is his birthday. Oh, like, we didn't know that when we scheduled to do this.
He would have been 53.
He would have been 53 years old today, and and he should be celebrating with his kids and his sister and his family, and he doesn't get to do that today. And of course, you know, days like today are particularly stressful for families, and you know, a lot of times in my experience, that kind of week and a half, leading up to the anniversary is even harder because of the anticipation of, having to go another year, having to celebrate another milestone, another
And
birthday you can't celebrate, and so, we didn't know that when we scheduled that. And sometimes we try to look at those things and see, can we line this up? Can we talk about this case on a significant day? And it kind of worked out today.
And if some of you are wondering why we're not talking so much about Leonard Davis, the other victim in this case, we weren't able to get in touch with his family. So we didn't really know much information of him. We weren't even able to get a photo of him.
No, we couldn't find anything on him. We were given I think it was a daughter's name and a phone number, but that phone number was probably provided to law enforcement in 2008, and
which is,
who knows how many times that phone number has changed hands, but it was no longer a good number. And we mentioned in your piece, that like we don't like doing a story without, that input and being able to let the family know, hey, look, somebody cares and we're going to put this out there to try to solve this.
I would have loved to have somebody who knew Leonard in the story, but unfortunately we couldn't. And we didn't want to not do the story because of that, So
exactly.
We still included, obviously his name is in there. He's also a victim in this case. He was also beaten and shot.
He was in his 60s, I believe, and he was the roommate. He was living there at the house as well. His family deserves answers as well. His family deserves justice. It is sometimes sad that we don't have that contact information and couldn't get their plea.
That happens sometimes.
But it does. I mean, there's cases that have been solved. There was one recently in town 4 months ago now where somebody just walked in and confessed to a murder, and I immediately was asking law enforcement, does the family know? Where's the family? How can we get in touch with the family? And the victim was transient and living in a halfway house and had no immediate family, and law enforcement could not find. They found some, distant relative that they were able to tell, and the family member was like, "Oh yeah, I think I did hear something one time about an uncle that was murdered," that happens, sometimes, but it's also why we encourage families to contact law enforcement regularly, just check in,
just to update
and
your
update your
information.
contact information. If you move, if you change phone numbers,
Right.
no one's going to know that unless you come forward and tell them that.
You got to reach out to them. You got to have some sort of relationship with them. Check in every few months, and also remind them that your loved one's case is unsolved. I mean, detectives have a lot on their plate.
They do.
So if you can help them a little bit with their memory, they'll appreciate that.
They do. We recently presented to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office an option that has been used in Colorado where annually you send out a letter, and it's a form letter. I mean, you change the name and you change the date and the case number, but in Colorado, the police department sends out a letter every year on the anniversary of the murder if it's unsolved, and says, the status of your loved one's case has not changed. We're here if you need to reach out and ask any questions. The case is cold or suspended or whatever terminology they use. If somebody comes forward with new information, we will look at it. And we feel like because we get so many comments from families that say we haven't heard from law enforcement, I never hear from law enforcement, we felt like that was a really good way to do that. Unfortunately, they have declined to adopt that policy, partially because we have so many unsolved murders in town, when you're in 1,500 unsolved murders. But I think also because they know that they don't have updated contact information on a lot of these cases. So you're going to put in a lot of time, organizing it, sending it out, and then you're probably going to get a lot of letters returned as undeliverable.
And then at the same time, there are murders, unfortunately, and crimes happening at this moment that they dedicate a lot of resources to, so that they don't become cold. But it's a struggle. It's a lot of resources and things that we can hopefully do better, and that's what we try to do here.
And hopefully, I'm still talking with them about adopting a policy maybe moving forward with that, where cases don't get solved, you do that, and I would like to see, hearing something's a lot of work to me is kind of a silly excuse,
not a good excuse,
you know,
yeah.
but I understand it. You know,
Right.
a lot of this is a lot of work, but you know, it's just going to get harder and worse. You know, you either start on it now and take that first step, or somebody's going to come along and have to take it, and it's going to be, you know, that much more complicated. But the suggestion I had, which is not something that that they do in Colorado, was to put a little tearaway part at the bottom for families to put their updated contact information or opt in. You know,
Right,
I mean, if you're
right,
worried about, you know, we hear sometimes people say things like, well, you know, some families don't want to be contacted, and we've had that situation like once. You know what I mean? Like, there may be some family members that don't want to be contacted, but for every family member that doesn't want to be contacted, there's typically 2 or 3 that do want to be contacted.
Right.
You know, and so
Yeah.
that to me is kind of a lame excuse as well. And let those families decide that. Like, give them
Right.
the opportunity, send them the letter and say, do you want to opt
Right.
in to this program or do you not? And
Right,
you
absolutely.
don't have to opt
That should be
in.
on them, yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
you know, these are things, and we present these to advocates and to law enforcement across the country as ways to look. If the number one complaint is we don't ever hear from law enforcement, then this completely eliminates that complaint. And you know,
It's true.
if an agency has advocates that can send those out, it's not taking anything away from the detectives.
Right, that
You
makes sense,
know,
yeah.
And I mean, it's
And you
something
could
we do
separate
here
it
at our
into-
office.
yeah.
We call on the anniversaries and we make a
Right.
phone call.
Right.
And yeah, it's a lot of them. And
Maybe
yeah,
you could
it's
separate it
cumbersome.
into like the 2008 unsolved murders and that kind of thing,
Yeah.
and put in groups. And I know it's daunting because there's a lot, but there's always a solution
There
to every
is,
problem.
There is, and that's always been our philosophy is, you know, no is not the answer. Like, maybe it's a different way.
Right.
But
You just gotta try,
always
at least
trying
try.
to try. And I think when you put these, you know, families first and you realize how important that is. Clint, we did a poll on Facebook a couple months ago now, back in August, and said, you know, with the assumption that nothing in the investigation has changed, it's still cold, no new information has come forward, do you think that law enforcement should reach out to victims' families annually? And it was the first poll we'd ever done. We had no idea what to expect. We had over 500
Wow.
voters in the poll, and once you vote, you can't vote again. So it wasn't
Wow.
like people were duplicating it. And it was 97% yes, 3% no. And then if you
Wow.
started going through the comments, the few people that said no, we started kind of engaging them and asking them why they said no. Was it personal experience? You have an unsolved case and you don't want to hear from them? And not one person from an unsolved case said, I don't want to hear. It was people, we had a couple people with solved cases that said, well, that might re-victimize the families, but it wasn't their
But it wasn't-
personal
right.
experience. And then other people said, well, I haven't lost anyone, but I would think that might,
Right.
it might hurt their feelings to be reminded
That's
of that.
interesting,
And
yeah.
so then we shared with them that, you know, you're not reminding these survivors of anything. Not a day goes by that they don't think about their loved one. You know,
You don't have
so
to remind them; they already know.
You don't have to remind
Yeah.
them. It's
They're
not
already
a
suffering.
reminder.
Yeah.
You know, so now are there situations where people don't want to be reminded? You know, sure, but
Every now and yeah,
you know.
but in our experience and doing Project Cold Case Stories, it's been my experience that people do want to talk about their loved
It's
one.
therapeutic
Yeah.
typically, and it's nice to know that someone cares enough to bring your loved one up.
Absolutely.
Siobhan and this case, the surviving sister, you know, she's made multiple comments about she feels like she's alone in this fight. There were no other stories after that initial story until you came along and did one, you know, and
That alone means
renewed
so much.
interest after a decade, you know, and now we're gonna, you know, this is out there today. So, in the last year and a half or however long it's been, this has gotten more publicity than most cases, or than it had previously. And we have families tell us that all the time. Missy Ellison's family has done a great job of keeping her story out there, and they tell me all the time, like, that case, until Project Cold Case came along, nobody was talking about it anymore.
Right,
You know,
right.
nobody was sharing it. It wasn't on social media. So we do
glad that we can
recognize
do that for them.
how
Yeah.
important that is. and we kind of got a little bit sidetracked there. Off
No, but it's important. It's important to talk about that.
I think it was important, and it shows ways that we are always trying to make sure that the families are considered, that they're thought about, and that decisions are made based on them and their needs and wants, and that's why we do what we do. It's always fighting for those families. So, but in this case specifically, whether it's John Paul Stoner or Leonard Davis, we've focused on John Stoner's case. But if somebody has information on a Leonard Davis and his murder,
yes, please.
That's the same case. It was a double murder that day, and in the apartment they were sharing. So call Crime Stoppers. The number's up there on your screen: 1-866-845-TIPS. You can remain anonymous. You're eligible for a reward up to $3,000. We talked to Wiley Hodges, and it is $3,000 when it's a murder. Like they have to say up to $3,000, because if you're calling in a tip on a car break-in, it's not going to be $3,000. But if you're calling in a tip on a sexual assault, rape, murder, those kinds of violent crimes, it's going to be $3,000. And this side of town, you went out to the scene.
It was called Turtle. The name Turtle was in it. It was in it.
Like
yeah,
that?
I don't think it's called that anymore. But back then it was called Turtle Creek or something Turtle.
Yeah,
it's on Harts Road.
Harts Road, which I think is that the west side of town?
Jacksonville's so big.
I know.
That it's, and I want to say
all your time on one side.
And it's so these small streets sometimes are it looks like it was like.
Okay, so it's like northwest. It's like
toward the airport.
Toward the airport. It's up there just south of the 295 loop around town, and just west of I-95.
Right.
Yeah, just a little bit before the airport when you're heading up to the airport in Jacksonville. And somebody sent me a text and had a great piece of information that we need to throw in. It's specifically on cases like this where there were witnesses, there were multiple persons of interest that may be willing to come forward now and kind of plead their case. That 68% of cold cases are solved by a change in relationship, not by advances in technology. So
isn't that amazing?
I mean, it really is.
That's all it takes.
And so when you're talking about cold cases, they're cold for a reason. It's typically because the physical evidence doesn't lead to a suspect.
It can only get detectives so far.
Right.
They need that other step, which is information. I mean, they're driven by information.
And if somebody was dating one of these persons of interest at the time, or was friends with them, or you know what I mean?
Please call.
Yeah, or if you are one of them and you've had, you
found
religion, or
but you can't sleep at night because you heard this, and you may be able to not just solve this case, but who knows if these suspects were able to do this in this case. It could be very certain that they've done it in other circumstances. So you can potentially help solve more than one case.
Exactly. So, thanks, Lorena, for coming in today with your.
Thank you for.
Do you have to go back to the station?
We're going back to the field to finish putting everything together. We'll be live at 5 and 6.
All right. Yeah. Well, keep an eye on that breaking story. You may have heard it here first. I'm sure it went on Action News at noon.
Yes.
But
if you weren't watching, then here.
I know a lot of people will listen to our Facebook Live, while they're at work or whatever, and then watch it later. So some exciting news. Morning for you.
Yes.
And now back to the scene.
Back to the scene to keep on gathering information.
Thank you for taking a break to come and join us and talk about this. I know that the family really appreciates that. Like I said, we didn't know that today John Stoner should be celebrating his 53rd birthday. And
we're thinking of
them. Not able to, but we're thinking of the family. And thank you all for watching and paying attention. We'll be back next week with some more, with another Facebook Live. And thanks for tuning in. Be sure to share this and like it on social media. That's how we reach people. We'll see you next week. Thanks.